we are all about. Just a reminder, we've got another session to come up before lunch. Do stay seated if you at all can. It's much nicer to talk to people. I can promise. If you're using social media and you're tweeting out about the conference, please would you use the hashtag IGConf22, and the handle for the CPP is @CenterProPolicy. So next, I'm hoping that my contributors are waiting in the wings. Business case, how to drive inclusive innovation. UK economic forecasts can make for grim reading at the moment. Consumer confidence, as we've been hearing for so long, has been a mainstay of UK growth, but it hit a record low in September this year. Rising interest rates, high and sustained inflation, and wider economic and political instability mean that consumer confidence could sadly drop further still. Even then, a decade of low productivity suggests that we need to look elsewhere as a solution to sustainable economic growth. So in this session, we're going to look at how we could break out of our productivity malaise and whether the process and gains for innovation can be spread out beyond just a few people or a few businesses. I'm going to be chairing this session, and very quietly, my panelists have arrived by sleight of hand. In the middle, Tera, Allas, CBE, leads McKinsey and Company's research on economic growth, productivity, technology adoption and the future of work, with expertise in economics, public policy, technology, and leadership. It's quite a portfolio you've got there, Tera. She serves as chair of the Productivity Institute Advisory Committee and trustee of the Royal Economic Society and Be the Business. Just to my left, Richard Bonner is Northern City's executive for Arcadis, with whom he's worked for more than 15 years. An experienced business leader, Richard works with transport providers, local authority leaders, and the private sector across the North of England powerhouse to help them navigate the evolving demands of the urban environment. He helps cities take advantage of levelling up investments to create thriving, connected places to live and in which to do business. And at the end, Professor Jane Robinson is Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the University of Newcastle. She leads the university's engagement and place strategy, focusing on building partnerships to enhance its contribution socially, economically, and culturally. But in a past life, Jane was the chief executive of Gateshead Council, and she played a leading role in the establishment of the North East Combined Authority and Commission on Health and Social Care and Integration. Your panel for this next session, folks. So first of all, Tera, for a leading economy, productivity comes up time and time again as where the UK could do better. Where are we going wrong? How close are we to solving that puzzle?
It's a really challenging puzzle to solve because it has a lot of pieces. If it was a magic wand or a silver bullet, I think we would have fixed it already. We are getting closer, though, I think, in the sense of, people's understanding of the problem is enhancing every day. And we're also getting, some of the key messages to land. So if you simplify really, really down to the core, then I think our productivity problem, to solve it, we will need investment in infrastructure and in skills and in innovation. But not in a blanket way, not in every kind of infrastructure, not in every type of skill, and not in every type of innovation. I think the real kind of sort of next S-curve we'll get onto is when businesses and governments together, including with local governments, get into that kind of next level of detail and say, well, exactly what kind of skills and for whom and where, and then go ahead and invest, because the returns are definitely there.
Richard, does that make sense to you when you come at it from the sort of Northern Powerhouse perspective, that it can't just be a blanket one-size-fits-all solution?
I think exactly right, when George Osborne really brought this idea that actually we could devolve powers to city regions, to metro mayors, he was really making the case that we needed to make sure that much more of that decision-making was being made at a local level and in partnership with the various different stakeholders, whether that's the universities, business leaders, and the whole raft of other stakeholders. So to Tera, to your point, as we start to make our investments in infrastructure, skills, business growth, actually they are about the needs of citizens and businesses in those local areas. And we'll talk a bit more about it, I'm sure, but actually we're starting to see some of that progress being made. We're seeing some longer term investment funds that have been devolved, and we're starting to see how that investment is starting to make a difference at a local level.
Richard teed it up nicely, Jane. What difference can a university like Newcastle make, or other higher education institutions for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think universities can play a huge role. I mean, I think sort of to your earlier point, we know that we've had for many years under governments of all complexions a very one-size-fits-all, place-blind approach to productivity and economic development. I think one of the things that universities can certainly do, and a university like Newcastle, which was founded by the pioneers of the Industrial Revolution, that's deeply connected to that local community. I think coming back to Tera's point, it's that sort of sense of how do you bring together the innovation that will drive the future of the economy with the skills and education that will connect that to a local workforce. And I also think that as large institutions and employers in place, we can play our role in terms of our commitment to things like real living wage and the way in which we support social value procurement. But critically, it is that sense of knowing and being connected to your place and the specificity of what is required in that place.
To what extent is this going to be then inclusive growth and innovation necessarily always about STEM as opposed to other industries, and particularly sort of maybe creative industries?
Absolutely critical to see that holistic approach. I mean, there's a lot of focus, I think, on STEM subjects, and that is really important. But actually, we need to make sure that we have that wider skill base, that some of those transferable skills that will often come from subjects in arts and humanities, for example, that employers tell us all the time are going to be critical for the workforce of the future. If UK PLC wants to be competitive on a global stage, having that very rounded approach and those transferable skills is going to be key.
I mean, that would be hugely relieving to a lot of students who sometimes are told, aren't they, that the humanities and arts subjects that they're doing aren't useful, aren't relevant, and yet I always like it when my panellists nod sagely at each other. You were nodding vigorously, Tera.
Yes. I happen to be involved in various initiatives trying to look at this kind of granular level, what skills are we going to need in the workforce by 2030, and absolutely it's going to be a mixture of all kinds of things. What's really important that we really need deep tech skills, but only in a few people, not 35 million people in the workforce are going to need to be able to do coding and programming. Everybody does need to be able to interact with a digital device in order to be able to do their day-to-day job. And for sure, everybody's going to need communication skills, teamwork skills, problem-solving skills. And these are all kind of things that can be taught alongside any subject, really. My other key point, though, that I want to make is from a business perspective, innovation is not just about STEM or R&D. If you ask businesses where they get their ideas from customers, from suppliers. And there's a very large element of design and creativity and really understanding what is the day-to-day problem that my product or service will solve. Because it's only if you do that someone's actually going to be willing to pay any money for your innovation. And if they're not willing to pay any money for it, then we don't grow the economy.
There's some serendipity in it then. You can end up, I'm sure, Richard, heading off in directions you weren't expecting.
Well, I mean, I think we find that even, in my organisation, Arcadis, where we are full of engineers and designers, actually, to your point, our ability to engage with our clients and understand their customers, drivers and needs is really critical. So yes, we bring scientists in and we have lots of graduates, but actually that ability to understand, interpret, storytell, and then co-create some of those solutions is really, really critical. But I did want to come back to a point, actually, if I may, just in terms of why R&D is critical. There's a very interesting set of statistics, and Jen, I'm sure you're on top of this, but we invest about 1.7% of GDP on R&D, and the G7 average is about 2.4%. So it's incredibly important that we get very locked into not only putting government funding in, but to attracting private investment into that sector, because if we want to get our economy growing and moving, we've got to absolutely ensure we're creating the right environment for R&D investment.
How do you encourage people then to keep investing at a time of contraction when they're really watching every pound that they spend?
Well, I think what we find is that when you are investing towards some of those activities that are coming out of universities where we're creating great ideas and opportunities, actually the markets are generally really hungry for that. So if you're purposeful in your investment, and if it's towards something and it is done with the appropriate research, academics, and putting yourself towards working with the future funders, and I think businesses do want to invest generally.
Yeah, so if I add on to that, the research we've done recently looking at resilient corporations or resilient businesses, looking at who was it that actually did quite well or relatively better in the previous crises, we find that it is definitely businesses that kept investing in innovation, kept investing in R&D. And also during the COVID crisis, we actually see in the UK numbers that one of the few types of business investment that did not drop dramatically was R&D. So I think there's a lot of hope there that businesses and the sort of stakeholders that they interact with, they are thinking beyond this current economic cycle. They're thinking about their competitiveness beyond it. And of course, that is all about creating the kind of next wave of growth through new products and services.
Yeah, and I think there's a role that universities can play in terms of making it easier for business to access that expertise and those facilities. So, for example, in Newcastle, we have a scheme called Arrow, which is really about connecting SMEs to world-leading experts, but also facilities that are available within the university to help them to innovate. And they can then see that the growth in their productivity that comes from that innovation. It becomes a virtuous cycle. So I think there is something about how we can work collaboratively with our partners to create that ecosystem which connects all of the different aspects that Tera and Richard were talking about to make a more productive economy in different parts of the country.
This conference is all about inclusive growth. So Tera, how important is innovation going to be for that type of growth, which of course will come on to how we get it to sort of spill out to benefit more people?
Absolutely. And I think there are probably two different ways of thinking about it. There's the traditional economist way of thinking about it as well. If we grow the pie, then we can redistribute it in a way that's more inclusive. And I do sign up to that. If we don't have any growth, then it's very difficult to redistribute anything. It's hard to pay for the public services we need. It's hard to invest in the kind of future growth and well-being of the country that we need. I think there are more subtle ways to think about it as well. And that's about where we, either governments or other funders or indeed businesses, focus their innovation activity and the degree to which they solve problems that are ones for the minorities, for example, ones for not just for themselves. And I get this situation, a lot of discussions with senior people is they tend to extrapolate from themselves. And they say, oh, wouldn't it be amazing to have this kind of app that allows you to figure out, your childcare arrangements, whatever. And you're like, but that's applicable to 1% of the population. How about you go and listen to the people who really need their problem solved, and how about you put your attention to solving those kinds of problems? And I really genuinely think that one of the levers to move more in that direction is also just to improve diversity in the STEM subjects, in the kind of the people who kind of ultimately end up making decisions. If they're not able or willing to think about the kind of broader group of people who benefit from their innovation, then I think we might be stuck in the kind of 1% world.
It's that idea of diversity of thought, isn't it, which universities in particular, Jane, must be alive to.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical. I think we know, going back to people like Richard Florida, that places that bring together people from diverse backgrounds are the most creative and the most successful. And I think it's so important to be able to retain that sense of those different ideas. I do think, thinking about a place like the Northeast, the whole question of inclusive innovation has to be connected to education and skills right the way through from the earliest years to postdoc. And I think we need to be able to think much more holistically about our approach, in that we've traditionally sort of seen government departments, whether that's BEIS and DFE, operating in real silos. And I think the opportunity for us is to say, how do you actually create an environment in places where you bring those things together and you make those connections across education and across innovation?
Yeah, the first session this morning, this is what struck me, was that so many people who were asked in a poll by Ipsos, or so few people, said that they thought that better education was going to be an important ingredient to levelling up. They were, many people understandably, concerned about the idea of more affordable housing across the country, but better education seemed to come quite low down. That's somewhat surprised me. How do you reach the people who need the help most across the Northern Powerhouse, Richard? How do you get to those people who are by definition hard to reach but would benefit most potentially from inclusive growth?
There's a whole raft of different interventions and support mechanisms required, and I'll give you a really interesting example. So one of the benefits of devolution in Greater Manchester and other city regions is being able to take control of the buses. And Mayor Andy Burnham decided quite rightly that he would unlock free bus passes to 16 to 19-year-olds. And that was really purposeful because it was about connecting people from Oldham and Rochdale to colleges around the city region and to jobs and education. And there's a direct correlation actually to A-level results over the last 2 or 3 years, where you can see an improvement in the A-level results as a potential direct consequence of giving that age group free bus passes. It was taking away a blocker and getting young people to the places where they need it. So it's a great example where devolution at a local level can make a quick, significant difference.
How did they come up with the idea that they even needed to do that? Because it would be such an easy thing to overlook.
Well, I think we find this wherever, and I live in Bristol actually, and I've got a colleague in the room, and we are trying to work really hard to connect some of our disadvantaged communities. And when you go and talk to those communities, often people are afraid of almost leaving them. It's difficult, the buses are difficult to get hold of, etc., etc. So making it low cost or zero cost and accessible can make those significant differences for communities where sometimes endemically that's not how they operate.
What about the concern that some people have that they won't have the skills then in the northern cities? Because the automatic assumption is, well, I've got to have a high-tech skill. How do you disabuse them of that idea and say you can still take part?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I saw Ben Page's sentiment earlier on about the North East. It was the only area that had a negative sentiment. And I was fortunate to be at the government's Green Trade and Investment Expo in Gateshead only a few weeks ago. And my goodness me, and Jane, we were talking about this earlier on, the investment that's going into the North East around renewables, green energy, industrialisation, etc., etc. And many of those jobs actually don't need to be super high tech. They just need to be moved on a few notches. And with the Metro Mayor and with universities and skills providers, they're starting to make a real difference. So I think we're starting to see the system in a place join those dots up better.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that there is something about understanding your place and the interrelationship between all of those different aspects and what's important to people and what are the barriers to people, whether that's transport, housing, good schools, a great place to live and great culture, really kind of understanding that. One of the things we've done in the North East, working with the Combined Authority and the universities, is to develop a thing called Insights North East, which is about really building an evidence base to understand the place, but also to understand what works locally so that you can then build on that. And I do think that sort of having that evidence base, but critically engaging directly with those communities about what's important to them. And I think, kind of understanding where those opportunities are. In the North East, there's a huge amount going on around electrification, for example, as part of a kind of journey to net zero. And in many ways, we've got, building on our industrial heritage, we've got huge opportunities. And it's about building those pathways so that people see these as real opportunities that are accessible to them, but making it easier, getting rid of some of those barriers for people to take advantage of that future economy.
And part of the green economy, those the green job creation, that's still in people's minds even in this time of contraction.
I think people, where there are real opportunities that are relevant and accessible, then yes, absolutely. I think people, and that's the thing. It's often about sort of recognising that those opportunities are there, and as I say, creating those pathways.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would add to that of course business is always very concerned about uncertainty, as are the kind of broader markets. Anyone making a big investment worries about whether it'll ultimately be one that provides some returns that they're expecting. The nice thing about some of the green initiatives is that they're what we call no regrets moves. It doesn't matter what happens to the oil price or the gas price. Insulating your house is better is going to be something we need to do, for the next 100 years. So let's just get into it. And I heard some debate earlier today about the trade-off between, should we be upgrading these skills or, training these people or whatever. I don't think it needs to be an either or even kind of immigration type situation. If we had too many engineers, we could easily figure out what to do with them. If we had too many people who know how to do loft insulation, we could very easily figure out what to do with them. And those would be productive jobs and opportunities for people. I think there's too much of a mindset of, let's try and finesse and somehow predict. It's not possible. Mm-hmm. So my suggestion would be to be much more open-minded about it and say, well, where do we build options for the future? We don't have a crystal ball, but we can build some basic skills that are just incredibly applicable across the entire country and across entire sectors, almost regardless of what the exact future looks like.
Too many engineers. Imagine that, Richard.
Well, as a civil engineer, I'm not sure about that, actually, to be fair. But I mean, it's interesting. I think about the green economy, we are one of the only major economies that has legislated net zero 2050. It's a hugely important platform. We have decarbonised our electricity grid more than any G20 country. We've got some brilliant foundations. And actually, we are world leading when it comes to offshore wind, as an example. And the forecast of the spend into those areas, we've got about 100 billion to spend in our energy network over the next 10 years, and another 130 billion up to 2050. That is money that is coming into our economies. That's about building nuclear power stations, offshore wind farms, battery storage, grids. That is not going to change. That is happening. We've got to make sure that we get behind it to build the skills necessary, but we can see that future investment ahead of us. We're not going back. We're not going back to fossil fuels. We're not going to stop or slow down that pace of investment. It's massively exciting. We're not doing enough as a government to talk about it, but we've got a great future ahead of us in that regard.
That will surprise quite a lot of people if you listen closely to what was happening at COP27.
Well, I think this is where actually sometimes the rhetoric at a global level can be a little bit different. But not many leading countries are pulling back from their commitments to 1.5 degrees. Many organisations, ours is a case in point, we are making commitments corporately to 1.5 because actually that helps us around attracting talent. It helps us to lower our cost of financing and funding. It's what our clients want us to do. So I think in many respects, we're not going back from that. And yes, there'll be some bumps along the way at the level of COP 2027 and beyond, but the stable doors are open and we're not coming back into the stable.
I think I agree with that, and the fact that we've legislated as a country, the commitment to phase out the combustion engine. We need to make sure that we are providing the skills base and the innovation to deliver on those legislative commitments. I think the challenge we have, and we see this a lot, is actually thinking about the needs of the future economy when we have a system which largely thinks about short-term needs. So the incentives for both employers and for many education providers is to provide the skills needs for today rather than what we're going to need in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that our ability to be more, to think more creatively about how we can provide for that, given a sort of system at the minute, which I think mitigates against that, is quite important.
With 5-year government terms, you have to get your skates on if you want to get something done.
So absolutely, but equally, I mean, I would endorse the sort of sentiment of this discussion that the actual needs, whether they be today's needs or future needs, they're best known by local people, by local businesses, by smaller communities, because they're so diverse. You know, there isn't going to be a single blueprint for the UK economy as a whole. And I'm really encouraged that there are a lot of actors, including universities and other educational institutions, as well as businesses, who are just like getting on with it, as it were, not waiting for that blueprint, because that blueprint might not arrive. I do want to emphasize one other thing that hasn't really come up quite as much in this conversation, which is the reskilling of older people. Because we've done some work at McKinsey Global Institute looking at human capital, and of course we would all accept that in today's day and age, it is the most important kind of capital you need to be building into your society and your economy. And about 50% of it is actually delivered by employers, reskilling and upskilling people once they've already left the education system. So it's a kind of 50-50. It's not an either or, it's a both and situation. And the average person who needs reskilling is 40 years old in the UK. We need better policy and better business action and ways in which we help those people reskill as well. All of the educational stuff, incredibly important for our future generations, but not enough.
How much of that is about mindset, though? Accepting that these people still have decades potentially to work, and will need to work for decades.
I think some of it is. I think if there is a silver lining from the current shortages of labour in our current economic situation, it is that everybody's going to need to start thinking much more creatively where they get the future talents, and not just think in silos, but actually go, well, okay, these people don't have quite the right degree or quite the right skills, but they could do, and they will do if we take them in and we retrain them. And it's not even that expensive. So we've done some research which suggests that 75% of all reskilling actions by businesses actually makes more money for the business, as well as, of course, then provides that individual with skills for the future and better pay. And, you know, it's kind of like a massive win-win.
I think it's so important, the points that you're making there, Tera, around, you know, we know that the changing demographic is kind of one of the biggest challenges we're facing as a world, but also one of the greatest opportunities. So I think by 2030, 1 in 6 of us are going to be over 60. Obviously none of us. But you know, and the longevity economy is worth a huge amount. At the same time, economic inactivity in that age group, certainly in the northeast, I think probably across the country, is one of the biggest challenges to productivity that we're facing. The other really important point about that is that a lot of research shows us that if people stay economically active, then actually they will live longer and healthier lives, and that is also a huge challenge and an opportunity for us. So I fully agree with that point. I would say that as universities, we are getting much more aware of the need to provide flexible education that allows people through different points of their life course to engage in learning and education, you know, in different ways, stackable credentials and so on, so they can come in and out and reskill and upskill. And I think that's certainly something that we're looking at.
It's come across loud and clear from all of you already that the importance of different solutions for different places is essential, and harnessing local expertise, local need early on is important. Where's the evidence, though, Richard, that inclusive innovation will, with the right conditions, reach more people, not just those who are it's centred on, maybe the businesses or their particular communities?
I mean, just taking it back a step from a UK PLC perspective, what we have recognised is that levelling up is not about taking from one area to another. We know that for the UK PLC to be successful, we still need a strong and vibrant economy in London and the South East. That's a big, major building block on how we work. And so what we want to see is that sort of drive towards reaching the sort of economies where actually we are in deficit, and there's a lot of that as an issue across the north. What's really fascinating, if you want an evidence point that indicates that we are making some strides towards rebuilding our northern economies. If you look at the FDI, which is the inbound foreign direct investment, there's been more growth in the north than there is in the south and the southeast. We're seeing more foreign direct investment coming into our northern cities. And if you look at some of the building blocks behind that, the University of Manchester, as an example, with their Graphene Institute, is starting to build incredible innovation that's dissipating into local supply chains, SMEs, and other areas. We've got the same in Leeds with the Innovation Arc and Nexus. And Jane, I'm sure you've got great stories to tell. If I go to Sunderland, where the towns funds are starting to be applied, linking private sector investment to investment in electric cars at Nissan, there's some great stories that are starting to emerge, that we're connecting our economies to our local people and to create those jobs. And again, we need to do more of the storytelling to bring that to life.
Jane, tell us some of those stories, because you said that evidence is essential if you're going to prove that what you're doing is worth doing.
Absolutely, and I think, Richard's referenced the work in Sunderland, and what we've been doing working with the North of Tyne Combined Authority, and we hope a larger devolved area in the not too distant future, is looking at how you develop that arc of innovation around electrification, which builds on the success of Nissan, looks at the development of opportunities around gigafactories creating batteries, but crucially connects that into opportunities for local communities. And it's all about a very collaborative approach between universities, colleges, schools, local government, working with businesses. And I think that the example of that, we've got an initiative called EPIC, which is the Electrification Process Innovation Centre, which is really building on models like those in Sheffield around advanced manufacturing and in the West Midlands, where you bring together these different component parts to connect them into those opportunities. And I think there's real evidence that that is starting to get traction.
I agree with all of that. I want to add one other angle, though, about innovation and growth and inclusivity, which is that all people are also consumers, and they massively benefit from innovation. Now, that might be unevenly distributed as such, because not everybody has access to the same digital tools or whatever, but there's a lot of research showing that people would be willing to pay tens of thousands for the free services they get on the internet at the moment. Obviously, a lot of innovation is also in support of people's health and well-being, so it doesn't kind of show up in kind of your traditional economic metrics, but it's still benefiting people who are essentially consumers or users of those products and services. And so while the kind of jobs angle is incredibly important, because it's just central to people's lives in so many ways, and also these communities, there is also the other side of the coin that, if people are seeing the benefits just by having access to better products and services, that's already an uptick in their living standards and in their well-being.
Do they recognise it as an uptick?
Not necessarily, and I think there is a challenge with the current rhetoric where we start every conversation saying, oh, productivity is terrible and people are no better off than they were 10, 15 years ago. Truthfully, we're essentially almost everybody is massively better off than 10, 15 years ago. If you just think about the kind of types of services you have on your smartphone or on the internet, or even just the way that certain aspects of the stuff you buy at the supermarket are just better products. However, I'm not saying that it reaches absolutely everyone.
No, you said that a few moments ago. You made that very clear.
It never can and will do. Just if you rely on market forces, you do need policy, and you need kind of bottom-up action as well to make sure that there's a sharing of that prosperity.
I heard that Andy Burnham, to mention Manchester again, they're setting up not just a food banks, which is, we've seen those grow up over the last 12 years across the country, but a data bank as well, where you can actually be given data for your phone, which you can't afford.
It's really interesting. In fact, we're working on a project in Greater Manchester with the local health trust and with one of the major developers, Bruntwood, in a very deprived part of northern Manchester. And when we looked at some of the the NAO data on digital exclusion, it was hugely stark. And so actually we're the whole group of us using our social value input and with some sponsored input, we've done a really interesting program of bringing citizens in the locality into a much more accessible digital environment. Because actually what we found, particularly through COVID and the pandemic, is that everything's moved to our devices. And so we are disenfranchising swathes of our community who do not have regular access to data, to internet, to Wi-Fi, to devices. And so actually it's a really important part, and it's a very high priority in Greater Manchester, quite rightly, and we need to look at that in our city regions, because if we don't keep people connected, they get very, very quickly disadvantaged.
There's a lot of talk about automation, technological change, artificial intelligence that could take away our jobs. How much of a risk is that? Is it overstated, Jane?
I think that sort of the opportunities that technology give us, I think, outweigh the risks, and I think the idea that what is important is that we are, because it will create different opportunities. But again, kind of coming back to a similar theme, it is about making sure that through that, the use of technology, we're not inadvertently growing the inequalities. So I think the point that Richard was making around how do you make sure that digital exclusion is not going to actually exacerbate some of the inequalities that we've already seen. And there's lots, I think, that we can do around, again, things like, we've been involved working with colleges and employers around digital boot camps, people kind of getting those opportunities to really become familiar. And also, I think, thinking about different communities in different parts of the country. We often, when we talk about innovation, think about cities. And actually, we really need to make sure that we are thinking about all of those communities, coastal communities, rural communities, where some of the access, we can potentially see how this shift to automation and technology can make things more accessible if we do it right for people who are perhaps living outside of those conurbations. But it is something that we need to be very mindful of, I think.
I want to talk, if we can, about the regulatory framework, policies at local level, at national level, and whether they're right at the moment for truly inclusive, innovative growth. To what extent do we have to have government, be it local or national, involved? Is it tempting or possible to sort of circumvent it at times?
So my starting point answer would be that you do need a partnership between local, national and governments and obviously all the other actors and businesses, because these problems are super complicated and complex to solve, and so no one player will be able to do it alone. At the same time, though, that should not be an excuse not to get on with the things that can be done. And as we've heard from multiple examples here, lots of people are doing that. I think if I were to highlight one area of policy where probably a bigger impetus, so we've talked about green and that's fantastic, but a bigger impetus from kind of policymakers would help, is around skills, to make sure that employers who can do such a lot to improve that human capital, that they have an even bigger incentive to do so.
But what are the institutions that we need that we might not have that would enable us to give people those skills? Are those basic ingredients even in place? I
think we have the institutions. We have universities, we have colleges, we have various different training providers. It's about, as you said earlier, it's about connecting them to the need. And then, of course, realistically, somebody has to pay for it. So I think this is the big challenge we have with skills in any country, is that there's what economists call boringly a market failure. If the employer invests in the skills of this person, they actually become more marketable, and they're more likely to leave that employer and give all of those skills to the new employer, which of course in a competitive market, lots of employers would be worried about. So you need an incentive for employers to keep doing this, because then it does benefit, ultimately kind of it comes around. The other person who was staffed up and supported by another business, somebody from them will come back to this business. So it does add up as a kind of positive thing for everyone, but it won't happen automatically. And so you might need some incentives for employers to do more of that.
Thank you. I'm a bit more optimistic about the skills agenda, because if I look at what's been happening through devolution, we've started to get much more systematic around creating local economic industrial strategies, whatever you want to call them, and they have a different flavour every month. We have long-term funding settlements to combined authorities that actually give them the wherewithal to co-invest with our colleges on the programmes that are needed locally. And we've started to see the pathways for business to come and get involved and start to join some of those dots up. Now, I think the one thing very specifically that's not working as well as it could do, and which is an area of government policy that I think needs to evolve and change, is in the apprenticeship levy. I mean, it's a tax on business, and we accept that, but we don't always have the ability to maximise our pot. Each company has its own pot effectively, and we would much rather the government worked at a local city region level and said, look, actually, this is what sits in your collective pot, and can we agree with the businesses in your local community that we can move those funds around? There's a lot of money that's locked up in the apprenticeship levy that needs to be invested locally. And I think if there was one ask of government at the moment, let's take what we've learned and let's mature it, and let's redefine the apprenticeship levy.
Different companies have a very different view of the apprenticeship levy, don't they? I mean, those that put in don't feel that they necessarily get out what they're due.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that, you know, as a specific policy intervention, it's that certainly is something that needs to be thought about. I mean, you know, as a large organisation, we contribute to the apprenticeship levy, and the restrictions on it mean that we're not able to fully deploy that. So we've found ways around that to work with some of our partners in the North East to pool what's left of the apprenticeship levy and actually use it purposefully in our place. But I have to say that's hard yards making that work. I mean, to your wider question around kind of the policy environment, I have to say, even though the sort of language of levelling up, you know, you never really know what day of the week, whether it's kind of, you know, in or out of fashion with government. But, you know, that sentiment of the levelling up white paper in 2021, well, I think was a real, you know, watermark in terms of, you know, government, which has been for many, many years place blind, acknowledging the need for a place-based approach. And I think it's really interesting, you know, listening to Rishi Sunak yesterday at the CBI talking about, you know, connecting innovation to, you know, effectively a kind of, you know, an approach to an industrial strategy. And the way, you know, we're seeing for the first time ever, really, I think, research funding councils building, you know, economic development objectives into research and innovation funding. So I think some of those shifts should give us a sort of sense of, you know, at least there are some hooks there. But I completely agree that actually, you know, that sort of sense of devolution creates a real opportunity for us to work with partners locally. It has to be still in partnership with central government, but, you know, there are things you can get on with, and I think that's what we're doing.
And if I can just come in on one other area of policy that struck me that will hopefully come out of the Levelling Up white paper, this was this realisation that actually when it comes to planning policy, we need to give not just power, but the ability to influence local citizens. And one of the opportunities that hopefully starts to exist is that local people have more of a choice as to what gets co-invested out of that planning uplift, that economic uplift, so that they can start to influence where they want to see social infrastructure, GP surgeries, transport networks, schools, hospitals, etc., etc. And I think if we can get the join up where local communities can have a better influence as to what that planning gain looks like, I think we'll see citizens feeling a lot more upbeat about the fact that they can influence what's happening in their
Well, how do they do that?
locality.
What's the mechanism by which somebody would be able to say what they want?
Well, I think this is where actually we have to recognise that our local politicians, our councillors, play a really vital and pivotal role in engaging with our communities. And it's one of the challenges that I see in devolution with regional metro mayors and their local authority partners, their leaders and others, sometimes making that connection from big strategic policy work to actually what's happening in specific wards. And it's at a level of maturity that we are not yet settled on. And I think that that's something that if we're equipping our politicians and our local leaders with skills, and Jen, I'd be really interested to hear on your thoughts around this, but how do we ensure that we are making sure that we work through the system so that our local politicians help to feed up those requirements specifically?
Do you see, Jane, that more councillors are recognising that they have a role to play at sort of a district level, a borough level?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that when it works well, and I think the example of the North of Tyne Combined Authority, which is a partnership between Newcastle, Northumberland and North Tyneside, is a good example of where locally elected politicians are sitting round the table with the elected mayor, feeding in. So you have a cabinet structure where those politicians are working together, and I think that's really important. But also working with other groups. So, for example, around North of Tyne, there was recently a citizens' assembly looking at the opportunities for net zero. So using those mechanisms and those connections, working with local authorities to try and really make those connections right the way through from grassroots community interest through local government, through the mayoral combined authorities. So, it's a complex map, but I think finding those ways of engaging is important. And as a university, we work in partnership with Citizens UK, which also has some really interesting models for how you work with local communities. So we're focused very much on how can we deliver inclusive growth in the North East with working with citizens.
But is the sort of impetus, the energy going to those communities to ask them rather than waiting for them to come and tell you? Because often people don't even know that that's an option, do they?
I think it's really important that it's that it is. I think Richard used the word co-designed earlier, and I think kind of creating the forum and the spaces, not to say to the communities, right, this is what's happening, what do you think about it, but really to sort of say, what do you see as the opportunities and the challenges for your place, and have a kind of a sense of how do you bring together then that with the decision makers who can really sort of make some of those changes that will influence people's everyday lives.
It's incredibly local democracy then, isn't it, when it works?
Yes, and we actually did a piece of work a couple of years ago called looking at government productivity. How could governments around the world, in fact, get better at delivering better services for less money? Because every government needs to be able to do that with an aging population. And an awful lot of it came down to this kind of local level engagement. And there are lots and lots of different tools out there you can use and lots of different approaches. But what you are saying is core. It needs to be something that resonates with the local population, and you don't know that in advance. So you may have to try a number of different things. But once you do that, you actually find solutions that cost less money and deliver better services. So my favorite example is from Australia, where the issue was to do with some kind of growing demand for cancer patient treatment. And it turned out that once they actually sat down with the cancer patients, they realized that the biggest problem for them was parking at the hospital. And that turned out to be really cheap and easy to fix. It wasn't about buying some really expensive new equipment. It wasn't about new hospital beds. It wasn't about getting new surgeons in. It was something really basic. And I love that story, because I'm sure there are a million other ideas like that could come from a more bottom-up thing. You still need the top-down strategy and linking it in, but we're maybe not getting quite as much as we could from that.
Hospital parking will resonate the country over, won't it? Richard, just a final thought, and then I'm going to ask people a question.
Just another example. So again, with my LEP chair hat on, many of you will remember what happened in Bristol in the aftermath of the Colston statue, and actually the debate that sparked around actually how are we treating our communities fairly and equitably. And the truth of the matter is that there are communities who do not want to come into City Hall, who don't want to come into the institutions in a city. So we've learned that we've got to go out and into our communities, and we've put some really purposeful investment into organisations like Black Southwest Network, where actually we're co-funding the facilities in the community that allow that community to get the support and engagement that they need. And I think we've got to change the dynamic to expecting people to come into City Hall and into our institutions and get ourselves out into the community. And it's just a small example, but we've got to do much more of that, shift our thinking.
Great, thank you. Right, microphones, are they at the ready? Yes, they are. We've got about 15 minutes, maybe not quite, maybe just over 10. I'm going to be as... Can I ask that your questions...
over there.
Yes. Can I ask that your questions are really tightly focused, please, and we will whip through as many as we can. The lady had her hand up here.
Thank you all. My name is Mimi Achipade from Cogent Analytics. I'd like to ask the panel how they see the current talk about sustainability and, with the environment, social and governance framework, how does that link into your discussion about innovation, inclusive innovation? Because, and I'll tell you why I ask this, because I think one of the easiest way from bottom up to get companies invested is by putting the inclusive innovation into the society bit of ESG. Thank you.
I can maybe start with a quick answer, because we see this sustainable inclusive growth and ESG as very much a kind of an overlapping agenda. And businesses are starting to realize that investing in ESG is not just about showing some credentials. It's not just about ticking some box. It is actually about doing good business, because customers are diverse and you need, because your investors will require those kinds of things, and because you can often save money by actually being more focused on your social purpose and on your sustainability. So you can clearly save money by reducing your energy consumption, which inevitably also reduces your carbon footprint. You can save money on your recruitment costs and your sick leave and whatever by actually treating your people in your employment better and giving them the kinds of skills and indeed health support that they need. And so to me, it's almost like ESG is not quite equal to, but it's very much the same idea as inclusive growth.
Gentleman there.
Joe Richardson from the Living Wage Foundation. I just wanted to revisit the conversation you guys had around economic inactivity, and I would be interested to get your views on the key drivers of that. I know that the main driver we're kind of aware of is that it's a product of long COVID, but I can't help but think there's more longer term drivers which may actually predate the pandemic. So I'd be really grateful to get your opinions on that. Thank you.
So,
Well, just briefly on that. I mean, I was talking before about we're trying to sort of build an evidence base to understand what's going on in the northeast economy. You're right that it's very clear in the northeast that the levels of economic inactivity have not bounced back to pre-COVID levels, and what we've seen is a lot of people who've exited the labour market coming out of the pandemic. I think the other thing that we have seen a lot is how that is linked to issues around an ageing population and caring responsibilities. So we're also seeing that particularly impacting in women in the labour market, exiting, and I think that one of the things we really need to think about is that connection between what we know is that huge challenge around health and social care that is just, kind of the thing that's just getting kicked down the line, but is a huge issue for us. But I would say that there's a lot of evidence to say that is contributing to the economic inactivity, certainly in the northeast.
And just to build on the point, I was at the Labour Party conference. I was very heartened by the fact that as a series of policy announcements, they're very key. The Labour Party, quite rightly, very keen to ensure that we get the right approach to allow people to be much more flexible and agile in the workplace. We've started to, all of our roles now are advertised as part-time roles so that we're much more open to large swathes of the community who perhaps wouldn't ordinarily join us. But I was also very heartened by the current government's recognition that there are lots of people who've been in the economy for a long time, got jobs and want to retrain. They didn't go to university, and that we have what they call the lifelong loan entitlement scheme, which has been announced, which launches in a couple of years' time. That gives everybody who has not been to university the opportunity to take the benefits of a learning loan so they can retrain. And I suspect there'll be lots of people who are in their 40s and 50s who might want to go back and take that opportunity. So I think there's some good policies that we're seeing from both parties emerging.
Lady there.
Yeah, Andrea Westall, different hats, but basically economist, policymaker. I'd like to push you because I think there's something about Britain which focuses purely, and you have in most of the comments you've made, on the rigidity in the sense of people to business, people to government, etc., and to education. When you look at innovation districts around the world, one of the key things that seems to define whether they work or they don't, whether they're inclusive or they're not, is around networking. In other words, the relationships between people, the porousness, in effect, of those organisations and the way that people pick up skills, they pick up ideas, and they collaborate together over innovation, over challenges, particularly for areas. And it does seem, could we be doing more of that in the UK? Because it seems that elsewhere, like Barcelona, there is far much more. And could we create spaces, places to enable that?
Yes. I think that point about creating opportunities for people to network. We have in Newcastle an innovation district, and we're part of an innovation district partnership across the UK that learns from these experiences. But I think it's called Helix because it brings together the quadruple helix of local communities, the public sector, the private sector, and academia, and actually creating those environments. It's very clear that is what is where a lot of those sort of sparks of innovation. Now, there is more to do. You use the word porosity, and for me, I think the thing about innovation districts is the kind of, how do you really make sure there is porosity between those districts and surrounding communities? And I think we've probably got things that we can learn from some international examples in that regard.
No, I completely agree. And I think we're seeing some of our university as institutions opening their minds up to being much more place-based. As you said earlier on, Jane, I'm seeing that elsewhere. So we're on a journey, but I think we recognise that we haven't got to ensure that what sits around those innovation districts is much more porous, as you were suggesting. So work to do.
If I could, just one quick extra one. In Helix in Newcastle, one of our neighbours now is the Newcastle United Foundation that has been developed to create opportunities for people of all ages to engage with football. And we have a partnership with the Newcastle United Foundation. If there's ever a way in the North East to connect wider communities to innovation, it is through the football. So that would definitely be something I would share.
Thank you. We've got two questions here, and then the gentleman at the back on the end, and the gentleman here with his hand up. Thank you.
Thank you. Patrice Clough from Minority Inclusion. It's regarding the digital inclusion. Could you give us a bit of an example how it works, the delivery points and access point, please?
Digital inclusion. How would it work? Is there a particular project that you're talking about?
Yes, we are minority inclusion, and that's one of the things we are working. We are minority inclusion company, organization, so we are looking at that.
You want to understand more about how digital inclusion can work?
Or how it's been offered.
Well, a couple of examples. So I mentioned North Manchester. What we're finding there's a huge regeneration around the hospital, housing, new technical college, all part of that ecosystem. And actually what we've recognised that we've got to go out and do very simple things like road shows, create open facilities where people can come in and hotspot off if our Wi-Fi networks, to go and actually use some of our local politicians to go and outreach into our communities. It's a small example, but recognising sometimes you've got to go out and reach in. And then we've got an example that we've been working on, Ed and I, in Bristol, where actually we're just reconnecting people to equipment. So we've used the city's convening power to bring equipment that is surplus to our businesses, and we're not unique in that, but to make sure that that's going back out into our communities, because as we found, many families are using one device for their kids to do all of their learning, and it's a nightmare.
Thank you.
Jim, also minority inclusion, but my question was, I hear probably from the news or something that there are lots of vacancies in the UK right now for jobs, and there are lots of people unemployed right now in the UK. And I was wondering what the panel thought that told us.
You're wondering what the panel thought what was, sorry?
Told us. What does it teach us?
Oh, okay.
I didn't hear the
There are vacancies and people who are unemployed. There's a mismatch, I assume, where those jobs are and what the skills are required. Is that
That is indeed the case. We have never really had this situation before. The labour market is the tightest it's ever been, and yet we're heading into a recession, or essentially, if you listen to the Bank of England, we're already in a recession. And it is a factor of mismatches. The mismatches at an occupational level, so we need more nurses, but we have people being laid off from manufacturing facilities, or we need more, computer programmers, and we have people who don't really have jobs in retail, et cetera, et cetera. So there were a lot of those kinds of mismatches, and of course some of the mismatches also operate on a regional level. So there will be some places in the UK where there will be more unemployed people and not as many jobs, and the other way around. The potential solutions to this, I think, is where the silver lining lies, because it will force employers to think more creatively, both about, well, could we take somebody from retail and retrain them? And you probably can't retrain them to become a computer scientist, but actually we've looked at the sorts of pathways you can actually retrain people into. And you've got a customer-facing person, they can become a call center person. That call center person has to deal with a lot of IT, they can become an IT service support person. That person has some skills to manage other people, they can become a manager of all of those other people. So there are pathways for actually people to move. It takes time. And the other thing I'll finish off on is the opportunities we already discussed around remote work. Not only about 30% of jobs can even theoretically be done remotely, but there will be pockets that could be extended in a way that allow people from rural communities or some of those communities with fewer jobs to go around to actually find jobs digitally.
I've got 2 minutes, I've got 2 questions. Gentleman there, and then we must end, I'm afraid. Yes.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. I wanted to ask about the role of central government in strategic policy making. I agree, I think you made some very reasonable criticisms. Do you think our current mechanisms are up to the job? If not, how would you improve them? And would you point to any governments who you think do this particularly well?
Richard, can you answer that?
Thank you. Just very briefly, when I heard Michael Gove present to the Convention of the North his ambitions for the levelling up agenda, what struck me is that he recognises he's got to join government departments up in a much more cohesive way. And what we heard last week is the Chancellor talk about Devo pots, so joining government funding up at much more of a place-based level. That's difficult, but if there's one thing we can do is to move forwards that agenda and to have interlocutors who can help to bring government departments together, then I think we'll be onto something.
Finally, question here.
Thank you. Peter Dickinson, Institute for Employment Research. I've researched skills for decades, and the phrase I keep coming back to is that skills is a derived demand. So it's how organisations sort of understand how to invest in their people resources and develop them alongside, their capital resources. So to what extent is that one of the biggest skills gap in this country?
Well, certainly we find that businesses are not yet thinking about investing in skills in the same way that they think about investing in equipment. But we also tell businesses that it's exactly the latter that they should be doing. If you think about your capital investment project and process internally, then the way you should be thinking about investing in training and skills and people is exactly the same mindset. What's the return on investment? How do we maximize it? And once you start thinking of that money not as an expense, but as an invest, it actually really unlocks how you think about your talent.
Thank you very much for all the answers. Thank you for the surfeited questions. It's great to have so much enthusiasm. Sorry we haven't got through them all. We will have more sessions this afternoon. I hope you will join us, but we do now need to say thank you to Jane, Tera and Richard, and invite you to take a break for lunch, but please be back promptly at 2:20 when we're going to set a few things on fire and try and tie it into inclusive growth. It's an inclusive innovators lab experiment, and I'm completely out of my comfort zone with it. So come back and see if it works.